Here's a shocking idea. What if our morality is killing us? Nietzsche posited the idea that the moral idealism of the European is actually a concealed aversion to life. And today, with the West apparently locked in a death spiral, this idea is more relevant than ever. Before we get into any history, let's look at concrete examples of how abstract moral attitudes get in the way of life in the modern West. First, let's look at a personal example. Vegans, motivated by a perfectly logical and understandable compassion for animals, which I actually share, go on plant-based diets to minimize their involvement with the suffering of animals. This makes perfect sense from a moral perspective, but these diets do not provide proper nutrition. Even when vegans supplement heavily, they usually end up to some degree sacrificing their vitality for the sake of their morality. Uberboyo pointed this out brilliantly several years ago, using Sam Harris as an example. Sam Harris has a secularized Christian morality. He believes that the goal of life should be to eliminate as much suffering as possible. Therefore, he went vegan. Again, perfectly logical. Why make animals suffer unnecessarily for your benefit if the aim of life is to minimize the suffering in the world? But he soon stopped being a vegan because he said that he didn't have enough energy on that diet. Implicitly, he chose vitality over morality. He decided that his vitality justified the deaths of hundreds of animals every year. Sam Harris was faced with the great dilemma of life, which lies at the foundation of every religion and every philosophy. You must either choose to assert yourself upon the world and engage in the often cruel struggle of life, or turn away from life and condemn it as evil for requiring such suffering. In the end, Sam implicitly chose life, his own vitality, over his abstract moral ideals. Now let's look at a political example, a controversial one: mass migration into Western countries. Mass migration policies are justified under the name of morality. We have a moral obligation to house and feed the world, say our leaders. But by implementing these mass migration policies, Western countries are harming their native populations, depriving them of space and resources, and destabilizing their social cohesion, and breaking down their cultural, ethnic, and communal identities. And simply on a logistical level, Western countries, especially the very small continent of Europe, cannot house the entire world. The idea that there would be an obligation to do so is quite frankly absurd, and the "we need more labor" argument doesn't really hold up either. If you have the interests of your native population in mind, rather than pure economic growth, it would be better to have a labor shortage which increases wages than an influx of cheap labor which puts people out of work. The declining birth rate argument for mass migration doesn't work either, because populations naturally balance out, as you see among animals in nature, and an exponentially increasing population is neither sustainable nor desirable. And this brings us to what I would classify as a religious example. Many young people in the West justify not having children because they think their children would be bad for the climate and for overpopulation. This is obviously illogical, since populations around the world will continue to increase, even if every Westerner doesn't reproduce. In reality, they're just removing themselves from the gene pool for the sake of a self-sacrificial moral impulse. But in doing so, they're also sacrificing their inheritance, their children, and the future of their civilization. This is almost identical to something which happened in late-stage Rome among Roman aristocrats who converted to Christianity, and, believing the apocalypse was near, committed themselves to celibacy, ending their royal bloodlines. And this actually brings us to the origin of this self-sacrificial moral attitude, which has so entrenched itself in the Western mind. The first time when you saw a self-sacrificial moral system based on the moral salvation of the individual soul in the West, and perhaps in the history of the entire world, was with Christianity. This is what Nietzsche speaks about in the first essay in Genealogy of Morals, titled Good and Evil, Good and Bad. Nietzsche posits that the idea of the good did not originate from a notion of benevolence for the weak or some sort of altruistic self-sacrifice, as we understand goodness today, but rather among the aristocratic classes who celebrated themselves as good. The aristocratic conception of good had nothing to do with compassion or self-sacrifice. It was a self-glorifying expression of power, an affirmation of the self. The good was synonymous with the noble, which was synonymous with the beautiful, the upright, the correct, the true, the virtuous. And the bad was simply everything which is not those things: the vulgar, the plebeian, the common, the deceitful, the ugly, the base. The bad was a lack of this goodness, this nobility, and everything which it entailed. Christian morality, in contrast, grew out of a messianic movement among the slave castes of Rome, which offered a vision of the future in which the suffering of the downtrodden would be vindicated and the existing social order would be overturned. The Christian value system developed as an inversion of the pagan value system, inverting the aristocratic conceptions of good and bad. The heavenly Jerusalem stands in contrast to Rome. The idea of the resurrection is an inversion of the pagan mystery rites, and Christian virtues are the inversions of aristocratic pagan ones. In Christianity, the conquered, the downtrodden, the base, the meek, the poor, and all of their qualities are exalted, while the powerful and all of their attributes are condemned as evil. Beauty, power, pride, vengeance, wealth, and mastery of the material world become vices, while abstinence, self-sacrifice, humility, the endurance of suffering, the tolerance of wrongs, and the rejection of the material world become virtues. This message resonated with the Roman undercaste, for obvious reasons, but it also resonated with the decadent Roman aristocracy, especially among the women. Much like among the elite in the West today, it provided them with a moral identity which could justify their existence and offer an escape from the malaise of a crumbling and decadent empire. In times of decadence and collapse, people search for a reason why, for a new identity to adopt, which will help them make sense of the world, and which will help them believe in the value of their own existence again. So it makes perfect sense why Christianity spread in Rome. But at the core of Christianity lies an unhealthy mistrust of the natural world, which the pagan religions celebrated as divine. Christianity introduced to Europe a belief system centered on faith in another world, a heavenly realm that promises salvation and relief from the suffering of this world, which again would have been very appealing during the decline of Rome and the ensuing Dark Age. But this emphasis on the salvation of the soul and the other world leads to a kind of nihilism and rejection of this world. Christianity teaches that suffering, violence, and death are a reflection of the fallen estate of the natural world, and that death is merely an error, a consequence of sin, not an inherent part of nature. Eden, where the lion lay down with the lamb, represents the true, uncorrupted state of existence, which will one day be restored. In contrast, the European pagans embraced suffering and death as intrinsic to the natural order, and viewed nature as both cruel and beautiful, both destructive and life-giving. And their gods were embodiments of these natural forces. And Christianity, despite its many subsequent forms, some of which are life-affirming, was ultimately born out of a rejection of this worldview and a resentment for the pagan master class which it represented. And I think this is well evidenced by the fact that, as Christians gained power in Europe, they destroyed classical art and literature, razed pagan holy sites, and persecuted those who adhered to the old ways. Of course, when the Germanic tribes adopted Christianity, they transformed Christianity into something stronger, more vital, which was at many times more pagan than Christian. If you want to hear more about this, I talk about it at length in my videos on the chivalric age and the pagan origins of chivalry. But despite this transformation of Christianity and the endurance of the pagan worldview, the fact that Christianity's theological foundations and original impulses were preserved in the New Testament ultimately prevented any kind of enduring integration of Christianity with the pagan worldview. Slowly, European identity began to become wholly a moral one, based on the idea of being the bearers of morality to the world. and this Christian idea carried over into modern liberalism. Both modern Christianity and liberalism are premised on the idea that we were evil and barbaric before, in pre-Christian or pre-Enlightenment times, but now we are enlightened. Now we have the correct morality, and it is our job to spread our enlightened values across the world. Both Christianity and liberalism posit grand moral visions, such as eliminating all of the suffering in the world, converting the whole world to Christianity, spreading liberal democracy across the world, housing and feeding the entire world, saving the climate, and so on. And these things can only be achieved through a self-sacrificial commitment to these moral ideals. But this moral idealism is completely out of touch with reality, and ultimately represents a rejection of life, since in these ideologies the world is fallen in comparison to the utopian ideal. This moral idealism, whether it's something small like choosing to be vegan, or something which will completely transform one's society, like choosing not to reproduce or open one's borders to the world, ends up resulting in much more harm than good because it completely ignores the concrete realities of life. And the ironic part is that if Western leaders redirected all of the resources which they spend on these moral causes to taking concrete actions, like eliminating pollution and factory farming, and reinvesting in their own countries, their own infrastructure, and their own citizenry, they could actually achieve moral ends and flourishing near utopian societies with ease. But their morality, their moral idealism, prevents them from doing this, since it would mean confronting the world as it is, not as they would like it to be.
To support this channel and gain access to the ARC's community and exclusive, long-form content, check the links in the description. Thank you for your support. It makes this channel possible.